Our history is no more than a series of incredible events. Every one of us can influence its course. From the birth of a 1,000-year-old empire to the death of a flourishing civilization. From the creative genius of a handful of men to a worldwide cultural revolution. From the darkest of totalitarian visions to the most horrific of great wars. From the heroic resistance of an entire people to the iron determination of a minority. The most infinitesimal of our decisions can influence the future of humanity. To know the past is to foresee the future. 1957, Mongolia. Army Group B under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. At the end of a veritable Cold War, the Third Reich has massed a gigantic army at the gates of the Japanese Empire. In a few hours, Operation Arminius will be launched. Emerging victorious from the Second World War, Germany and Japan gradually moved to a state of opposition. Both founded on an imperialist ideology, the two regimes were unable to agree over the long term, each aspiring to achieve world domination. Of equal strength, the Japanese Empire and the Third Reich embarked on a weapons race. Today, the world is on the brink of the Third World War. But none of this ever happened. In May 1940, a major strategic decision will change the course of the war and contribute to the defeat of the Third Reich. May 10th, 1940. Hitler triggers Case Yellow. The invasion and conquest of France. May 24th. Divisional General Heinz Guderian receives the order to halt his land offensive at the gates of Dunkirk. May 27th. General Gore, commander of the British Expeditionary Force, announces the withdrawal of his troops to England. These three intimately connected events are major incidents of the Battle of Dunkirk and will determine the course of the Second World War. December 31st, 1939. Ardennes Forest. It's -4 degrees Fahrenheit. The winter is exceptionally harsh. The soldiers of the French 9th Army are celebrating New Year's Eve in their way, but their hearts aren't in it. Since the 3rd of September, they are at war with Germany. Mobilized and then sent to the front, millions of men stand on guard, arms at the ready, alongside the British Expeditionary Force. But this war is nothing like what some of them experienced 25 years earlier during the First World War. Nothing happens. The enemy is invisible. This war of waiting is weird. It's a phony war. And yet, they are ready to fight. In 1939, the French army is acknowledged as being the best in the world. 2,240,000 soldiers divided into 94 infantry divisions. That is 4 times greater than Napoleon's Grand Army during the Russian campaign. Well equipped and armed with numbers of machine guns and good rifles, the foot soldiers advance under the protection of the best armored vehicles of the period. The S-35 is a redoubtable destroyer of tanks. It is designed to advance at the same pace as the infantry, withstand heavy enemy fire, and destroy enemy defenses. Staff HQ has learned all the lessons of the Great War. This time, the French army is ready to endure years of hard fighting. It will win this war, just as it won the previous one. The German army will be shattered on its defenses. Defenses that, incidentally, have been considerably reinforced. Constructed at great expense, the Maginot Line is a vast network of fortifications, bunkers, and tunnels. It presents a formidable obstacle to any army wishing to invade the national territory. It represents the entire French strategy. Protect the peace by wagering on defense and not on attack. Because nobody in France in 1939 wants war. The last one cost 1,300,000 men their lives. There is not a single village that does not have a memorial commemorating the dead.
Welcome to the memory of humanity. Here we can control time, analyze and compare billions of events, and alter them to rewrite history endlessly. All the events in our history, however minute they might be, are memorized and interconnected. It only requires one to be changed for all the others to be shaken to the core. For example, let's take a look at the Maginot Line. 400 kilometers long and armed with the most modern of guns, it is designed to protect the country. It is said to be impossible. In the 17th century, the engineer Vauban created the concept of the Pré Carré, square meadow, a double line of fortified towns to consolidate the frontiers of the kingdom. Perfectly suited to counter the progress of artillery, these fortifications are formidable. Frontal attack is highly risky, even suicidal. Cannonballs ricochet off the inclined walls. Assailants are caught in a deadly crossfire. Vauban's works were a real success. During that period, France was never invaded. In 1940, will the Maginot Line be up to the standard of Vauban's Pré Carré?
Ardennes, May 10, 1940. The German army attacks. Although France does not want war, the Nazi regime has been hoping for it for years. Leaning towards the offensive, the strategy of the German High Command is based on speed and aggression. Find the weak point in the adversary's defenses, force a path through, go around the enemy, strike him there and then before he has time to understand what's happening. It's a huge gamble. If the attack slows down, the enemy can recover, counterattack on the flanks, and reverse the situation. But by attacking the most powerful army in the world, Germany knows that they don't have the resources to become bogged down in a long battle. They have to finish it quickly. Germany risks everything. The Panzers, the German assault tanks, are organized in autonomous mechanized divisions and commanded by young and audacious leaders. Their mission is to charge through the Ardennes range and create a breach. In perfect coordination with their numerous and modern air forces, the Panzer unit generals have considerable independence in decision-making and can react quickly. The Maginot Line is impassable. The Germans won't even try to force their way through and prefer to go around it. At the point of attack, Divisional General Heinz Guderian. On May 13th, just 3 days after the start of the fighting, his tanks break through the front at Sedan. Nobody can stop them. The French tanks are divided between each infantry division, while the German tanks attack in a group. Handfuls of S-35s manage to hold out against the Panzer battalions, taking shell after shell, returning shot for shot. But the survivors finally succumb to the horrific attacks from the dive bombers. French Staff HQ is stunned. As veterans of the First World War, the generals don't understand how the enemy was able to move so fast. Everything is done to stop the avalanche of steel, but on May 20th, the 1st Panzers reach the channel and cut the front in two. 1 million French, British, and Belgian soldiers are cut off from their bases and in a critical situation. Guderian is on the point of delivering the death blow. But suddenly, on May 24th, the German High Command orders a halt to the offensive.
We have just reached a turning point. A turning point is a key event, a crossroads in our history where the world swings one way or the other. The Panzer divisions have just received the order, confirmed by Hitler himself, to halt and stop the battle. If the German tanks had continued on their implacable advance, they would very certainly have destroyed the entire Allied forces in the Dunkirk pocket. Today, this choice is considered to be one of Hitler's greatest strategic errors. If the Führer had allowed his panzers to attack, the outcome of World War II would have been radically different. Stripped of its professional army and its finest generals, England would not have been able to carry on the fight. It would almost certainly have been forced into peace negotiations. The United States would not have been able to assemble their troops in Great Britain. The Normandy landings would never have taken place. Without enemies in Europe, Hitler would have concentrated all his forces on the east against the USSR and would most probably have been victorious there too. The Third Reich would have won the war and today would be sole master of Europe. Let's continue.
Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, including the entire British Expeditionary Force, are encircled in a giant pocket of resistance. The situation is critical, but not desperate. Inexplicably, the Panzer divisions seem to have stopped. This respite is jumped upon. From all sides, units pull back to form a new line of defense. Troops still fit to fight are hastily assembled. At all cost, they must break the circle and go on fighting until victory or death. French HQ plans the counter-offensive. It intends to engage all available Allied resources to force a way out. But for General Gort, head of the British Expeditionary Force, there remains another option. Proportionately, England has not committed as many men to the battle, but they are the elite of its infantry. To lose these soldiers is to be left without any defense against the Germans. On May 20th, Gort no longer believes in victory, so he decides to save what he can and to secretly prepare the evacuation of his fighting force. Strategically, the only possible escape route is by sea, and on May 26th, the only port still free is that of the city of Dunkirk. In the following days, the British carry out a series of withdrawals to get close to it. Saving the Expeditionary Force becomes the British government's top priority. The Royal Navy and the Air Force fighters are mobilized. Code name, Operation Dynamo. The French don't know it yet, but their ally is preparing to lead the front. On May 27th at dawn, Gort meets the French generals and announces the evacuation. The French are stunned. Without British support, the counteroffensive cannot take place. The battle is lost. But in order to evacuate their soldiers, the British need help. They ask France to defend the Dunkirk pocket, where they have withdrawn to the last. In return, they promise to evacuate as many French troops as possible. The elite of the French army is defeated. The German offensive can no longer be broken. With nothing left to lose, French HQ decides to provide the defense and orders all available units to hold the line, whatever the cost. General Fagald is charged with the dangerous mission of commanding the defense of Dunkirk. If England survives, the struggle will go on. On the morning of the 27th, the Panzer Division resumes their offensive. The Battle of Dunkirk begins.
Gaining time. France, first among the military powers, has just been hit as if by lightning from the German army. Hitler himself is more surprised than anyone. The Nazi propaganda machine even creates a term for lightning war, blitzkrieg, to boast of its superiority. And yet, this audacious strategy cost the German forces half of their tanks and almost 2/3 of their combat aircraft. Because, far from giving way, the French army fought ferociously. The confrontations of a rare violence decimated the armies on both sides. It's what is called a Pyrrhic victory. 2,000 years ago, King Pyrrhus faced a Roman army. He won the battle, but with losses so great that he finally lost the war. The horrific losses of May 1940 most probably alarmed the German headquarters, still concerned over a possible counter-offensive. To preserve the remainder of his precious panzers, Hitler preferred to pause before attacking Dunkirk. The Germans had run out of steam.
At dawn on May 27th, the Luftwaffe planes rain bombs down on the port of Dunkirk. By that very evening, it is entirely destroyed. The evacuation takes place to the howl of the Stuka sirens, those terrifying dive bombers. Firefighters struggle with massive blazes. Civilians die in their hundreds. Off the shore, the British and French warships have difficulty in reaching the port, now blocked by the hulks of burning ships. Rapidly, soldiers crowd onto the beaches, more accessible than the port. Small boats ply to and fro in a shuttle service to the fleet's destroyers. Belgium warns its allies, backed into a corner, it can't hold out for much longer. On the evening of the first day, only 7,600 men have been evacuated. They need to go faster and gain time. On May 28th, Belgium surrenders. The situation seems disastrous, but at Lille, the remnants of the French army are holding out against 130,000 German soldiers and 800 armored vehicles. For 4 days, smashed by the bombs, the French troops engaged in a heroic combat. For 4 days, they prevent the enemy from falling upon Dunkirk. For 4 days, they salvage Operation Dynamo. In the air, other heroes throw themselves into the battle. British fighter pilots struggle to contain the German bombers. Day after day, they intervene in ferocious aerial battles. On the beach, a multitude of craft continue to evacuate the men in their thousands. 47,000 on the 29th, 53,000 on the 30th. Along the line of defense, the British troops leave their positions to move to the beach. On the 31st, Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, expresses anxiety over the small number of French soldiers evacuated compared to the British. In England, everything that floats is requisitioned and sent to Dunkirk. More than 800 ships of all sizes and all nationalities defy the German bombers and guns. Many of them end up at the bottom of the channel. On this day, 68,000 men are evacuated. The next day, out of ammunition, Lille, now a camp cut off, falls. On June 1st, in Dunkirk, only French troops are still holding the line, outnumbered 10-1. On the evening of June 2nd, the expeditionary force has been totally evacuated. The Admiralty announces Operation Complete. We are returning to Dover. And yet, in Dunkirk, 45,000 French defenders are still fighting on. One after another, the last battalions receive the order to evacuate. At the twilight of the battle, brave teams risk all aboard whatever boats they can find. The exhausted combatants pile on board. Under enemy fire, they destroy the last bridges, set up the last guns as a battery, fire the final mortars. Many choose to stay in position and cover their comrades' retreat as they run from the beaches. Everywhere they're fighting, smashed by the bombs. All strength and all ammunition is gone. France makes a final magnificent gesture. The Germans pay dearly for every inch of ground gained. June 4th, the Germans break into the destroyed city. A general addresses his opposite French number, now a prisoner, and asks him where the English have gone. The officer replies, "To England."
Holding out. The French forces received the order to hold the evacuation perimeter to allow their allies to get out of Dunkirk. French headquarters could have continued with its initial plan to counterattack. Instead, it decided to do all it could to protect Operation Dynamo and throw its last operational forces into the battle. This decision makes the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force possible and allows the Allies to continue the fight. About a century earlier, in 1836, the 200 Texan defenders of Fort Alamo were in the same situation. Besieged by 1,200 Mexican soldiers, they held out 6-1 for 13 days. At the end of the third assault, the fort finally fell into the hands of the Mexican army. All of the defenders, including the famous Davy Crockett, die in the fighting. But the time gained allowed the Texan army to prepare a counterattack. A few weeks later, it carries off a decisive victory over Mexico. Let's continue.
The Allies hoped to rescue 40,000 soldiers at best. They will evacuate 347,000, of which 280,000 were British. The Germans take 40,000 prisoners. 90% of the city is destroyed. Tactically, this is a German victory. The city has fallen into their hands and will remain there for 5 years. But strategically, the Germans have missed a unique opportunity to put an end to the conflict. The British Army is still operational, and amongst the evacuees are important generals such as Alexander and Montgomery, future victor over the Afrika Korps. Many of these soldiers will land on the Normandy beaches in 1944 and take part in the liberation of Europe. The British retained their ability to continue the battle. On the return to the United Kingdom, the soldiers were greeted as heroes. The Battle of Dunkirk was a feat of arms. But as Winston Churchill will say, wars are not won on evacuations. For all that, the Battle of France is not yet over. On the continent, more than 1 million soldiers are still fighting. France needs all of its troops, and the divisions evacuated from Dunkirk could swing the balance. Exhausted and decimated by weeks of fighting, the defenders of Dunkirk will transit via England, then land at Brest a few days later. But the situation has changed. In spite of opposition from the President of the Council and General de Gaulle, Marshal Pétain has decided to ask Hitler for an armistice. He orders all French units to cease fighting. He thinks he can succeed in saving what remains of France. The heroes of Dunkirk, after having held the city for several days, outnumbered 10-1, are obliged to lay down their arms and surrender to the enemy. For France, this is the time of the Vichy regime. But that is another story.
Winners write history. During the campaign in France, the German forces brought cameramen with them. Today, we have many images of panzers driving through the flaming hulks of French tanks. Never the opposite, and for good reason. There was hardly a single camera on the French side. During the Battle of Dunkirk, The only images we have are those taken aboard ships or on the beach. Nobody was there to see the last 50 survivors of the 137th Infantry Regiment charge with fixed bayonets. Today, the universally shared view, including in France, is that the French army did not fight in 1940. But the facts speak for themselves. The Germans lost more Panzers in May 1940 than during the Great Battle of Kursk, considered to be the greatest battle ever between tanks in history. France, overtaken strategically, gave all it had to contain the enemy forces. Unlike the British, the Americans, and the Russians, it did not have the time to adapt to this new form of warfare. Crushed by the German troops, France fought to save its allies and give itself the means to carry on the fight.